Jesus told an interesting parable one day. He talked about an unjust judge. And he said this judge in a particular community didn't regard man, didn't care about God, did his own thing. And there was a widow woman that lived there, and she came to the judge to be avenged of her adversary. It wasn't a specific thing she was looking for. She wanted payback. She wanted her enemy to be dealt with. And the judge threw her out. Well, she came back the next day and again wanted to be avenged of her adversary. He threw her out. This happened day after day. Finally, the judge said, even though I don't regard man, I don't regard God, this woman, by her continual coming, is going to drive me crazy. So he granted her request. The reason Jesus gave that parable is he said that men are always to pray and not to faint. But then he went on to say, and shall not God avenge his own elect, who cry out to him day and night, though he tarry long with them? The parable is about revenge. The parable is about dealing with your enemies and payback. And we don't think about that very often in the Christian community, but the reality is that God gave a parable and talked about it, and he said, vengeance is mine. I will repay, saith the Lord. In 2 Thessalonians, it says it's a righteous thing with God to recompense tribulation to those who trouble you. God will even the score. God will defend you against your enemies. But it's important to understand that it's God that does it. It's not us that do it. And pardon me for this, but I want to give you a couple of personal examples, and I think it'll shed some light on what I'm talking about. I've got a little cottage up in Halliburton, and for years it was water access. And then one day I decided to put a road in to the cottage, and I put a road 2 miles through the bush into the cottage, and the road came right along the border of the property, and then I built a garage with a little one-bedroom cottage above it. There's crown land behind it, and there's crown land right across the road beside it. For 320 feet, there's crown land, and then there's one neighbor down in what's called the thumb of the lake, and then the swamp. So there's one other cottage left. And that cottager is not somebody that is really easy to get along with. A lot of issues. For example, I have lawn because I put septic in, and he would take his dog and walk it through the bush, bring it over, have it do its business on our lawn, leave it there, and go back home again. Periodically, we would do some 22 plinking at cans on the property because we had all this crown land around us. And the police would show up. And time and again, he would call the police because he'd hear the shots. And the police would come, take a look at where we were shooting and what we were doing, and apologize. They said, there's absolutely nothing wrong with what you're doing, but we have to follow it up because we get a complaint. Twice a year, I had to take my boat over to what was called the government dock, where all the cottagers that were water access on the lake parked their cars and launched their boats. And I would move a trailer into the water where there was a boat ramp, and I would move my boat onto the trailer and put it away for the winter. And this one particular time, I hired a contractor to bring the trailer, and he brought it around and backed it, just starting to back it into the ramp so I could launch my boat. My boat was there, and I was tied up on the dock, and I left enough space for him to back the trailer down. He was backing the trailer down, it was right there. This neighbor came along, zipped in front, parked right where the space was where the trailer was coming down, and for the next half hour, lugged things one by one up to his car, didn't care that a contractor who was being paid was waiting with a trailer sitting there. It's just the kind of guy that he was. One day in the very early spring, I got a phone call, and it was from somebody across the lake. It was a small lake, but they could see across, and they said, Wayne, your cottage is on fire. We think your cottage is burning down. There's smoke we can't really see, but it's some kind of a forest fire right at your cottage. Well, I got a hold of somebody to unlock the gate. The fire people came down. And it turned out that a hydrant line had snapped and started a fire. And the fire started right along the side of the road, on my side of that road I built. And then it jumped over to the other side, and it burned across the 320 feet of crown land and burned down the neighbor's cottage. A month later, you'd never know that there was a fire. None of the mature trees were damaged. The brush grew back again. The only indication is that that one cottage was burned right to the ground. And my cottage didn't have a ash on the property, didn't have a burned leaf of grass or a blade of grass. talked to the fire people, and they said, it's absolutely amazing your cottage didn't burn down. We can't figure that out. This guy and his family ended up driving down my road. They were water access, asked if they could park because they wanted to walk over and have a look at the charred remains. There wasn't much left. And they ended up selling, and they're not on the lake any longer. Another person, when I built this road, I asked people if they wanted to participate, share in the costs and so on, and nobody did. But a couple people tapped into the road after the fact, used it, but never paid for the maintenance, never paid for the creation of the road. I never said anything to them, but they did that. Well, a number of years later, I was doing a directory on the lake, and I was talking to the cottagers on the lake to get the information to put in this directory, you know, their background, where they live, their contact information, and so on. And the one fellow who glaringly used the road constantly and never contributed to it, I contacted him. And I didn't say anything about the road. And he said to me, you know, about 15 years ago, which was when I built the road, he said, my wife, it was his common law wife, I should mention for a reason, contracted Alzheimer's, and her health deteriorated until she finally died. He said, the house we live in was in her name, but she told me I could have that house for the rest of my life. He said, the kids didn't see it that way. They threw me out and sold the house. He said, the other thing is that the cottage that I have is in her name, and they're selling that and throwing me out there too, so I'm not on the lake any longer. So there are two cottagers that were thorn in my flesh, if you like. I didn't do anything, didn't say anything, but they were both dealt with. And I could tell you other stories. I don't want to, because you'd be able to identify who the people are, and I'm not trying to identify anybody or malign anybody. I'm trying to illustrate the fact that God is our defender, and he absolutely is. And I'll tell you another little interesting thing is, years ago, my wife brought home this little kitten. And it was a wild cat from where she worked, and she was afraid they were going to destroy it. So we ended up adopting this little kitten. And it was kind of wild and always stayed wild, but it was a pet. And it would kill mice in the yard. But it always brought the mice back and dropped them off right at our doorstep. It was like it wanted us to know that it was a good mouser and it was killing mice. Well, not wanting to belittle us, but God's kind of that way. When God deals with people in your life, he will let you know. He'll bring it right to your face to face, so you'll know. I've had people who've been adversaries of mine come right into the office, right into the diner, and tell me the situation in their life, and it's God letting me know that he's dealt with it. He hasn't dealt with everybody. There's some people he's going to deal with yet, but I wouldn't want to be in their shoes. The Bible says, because sentence against an evil work is not executed speedily, therefore the hearts of the Son of Man is bent on doing evil. What it's saying is that because God takes perhaps a long time to exact vengeance, people go on their merry way thinking that there's going to be no day of accounting. But there will be. It's been said that God's gristmill grinds very, very slowly, but it grinds very, very fine. But the important thing is here, understand that our natural tendency is to want to pay people back. Drive down the highway, somebody cuts you off, you want to cut them off again. You want to teach them a lesson. You want to up the ante and do it maybe worse. God says, don't do that. In fact, as far back as the Levitical law in the Old Testament, the Bible said, if your enemy, who's your neighbor, has an ox or an ass and it falls down, help lift it back up again. If it strays into your fields, look after it, take it home, and return it to your neighbor. Jesus said, love your enemies. Do good to them who hate you. Pray for them who despitefully use you and persecute you. The scriptures teach all along. In Romans, we're told that if your enemy hunger, feed him. If he's thirsty, give him drink. In so doing, you'll heap coals of fire on his head, and God will reward you. So we're to let go. We're to let go and understand that vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. And in 2 Thessalonians, again, it says it's a righteous thing with God to recompense tribulation to those who trouble you. King David, before he was king, was part of King Saul's household. And Saul became aware that God's blessing was on David's life, and David was anointed to be the next king. And so Saul hated David and was determined to kill him. Twice he threw a javelin at him and stuck it in the wall because he missed David, but just barely. Once he sent soldiers to David's house to try and murder him in his bed. On numerous occasions, he gathered armies together while David was fleeing for his life and hiding in thickets and caves and so on. And on at least 2 occasions, Saul was delivered right into David's hands, once in a cave and once when he was asleep in a field. And David's men urged David to go and smite Saul. They said, God's delivering him to your hand. And David said, I'm not going to smite God's anointed. One day, God will deal with him. And one day, God did. God had Saul killed in battle, and David was established king on the throne. But the point was, it wasn't David's hand that was lifted up against his enemy, and yours shouldn't be either. In business, you're going to have enemies. You're going to have people who are wicked and evil and who cross you and who do things they ought not to do. Trust God. Let it alone. Return good for evil. Pray for those who despitefully use you. And you can know that God will return their actions on their own head, the law of sowing and reaping, and it's a righteous thing with God to recompense tribulation to those who trouble you. Thanks so much for watching this video. I'll talk to you again next week.